Good evening. Welcome. I'd like to call this meeting of the Manitou Springs City Council and work session meeting to order, please. City Clerk, would please call the roll. Present. Here.
Present.
Our first order of business tonight is a discussion of the MAC proposal, also pronounced MAC and Match, I think. More specifically, discussion and possible direction regarding ordinance number 2719, an ordinance amending section 3.12.120 of the Manitou Springs Municipal Code to increase the sales tax rate from 3.6% to 3.9%, and to increase the use tax rate from 3.5% to 3.8%, and adding a new chapter, 3.51, to the Manitou Springs Municipal Code to create a new special facilities and arts fund for the allocation of certain sales and use tax revenue assessed pursuant to Manitou Springs 2019 ballot issue 2D. Before we start, I'd like to make a few remarks, but I think what we'll go over tonight will be useful in our discussion. And it's like, you may have noticed as you come in, there's a copy of these along with the agenda, so I'm not sure you're welcome to do that. First off tonight, it's a work session, so we will not be making any formal decisions, we will not be taking votes, we will not be doing anything that has binding results. But we're here basically to discuss and try to find a path forward. Not making any decisions, let me emphasize that. We know that this topic has generated a lot of emotion and disagreement within the city. We want to move beyond that. Work sessions do not include public comment. At council's pleasure, we may have questions from the audience. If so, we would ask you to be concise and non-interrupting. So there's a lot to be done. We want all the discussion to be polite and civil in order to best contribute to tonight's outcome. We're going to try and do this in 60 minutes. Our overall goal, we want to respect the outcome of the voters, the outcome of the vote, and the will of the voters, and also we want to be sensitive to people. We're about as close to being a house divided as you can with 1.5 vote. So let's try to work something that's useful for everybody. The language of the initiative stipulates that tax would start being collected this year, 2020. The earliest the state could start collecting the tax would be July 2020. The language states that the earliest funds would be distributed would be next year, 2021. Therefore, the city has up to 11 months to develop implementation guidance. However, I'd like to emphasize we don't want to drag this out unnecessarily. The initiative's language is broad enough to allow the city a great deal of flexibility in its implementation. As we look back, we can assume it's clear that the initiative language was confusing. There were multiple issues. This led to multiple possible reasons why people did or did not vote for it. Assertions were made on both sides of the initiative, which may have contributed to voters' confusion. Tonight, we would like to determine if council wants to revote the same ordinance that was presented to the previous council last December 10th? If yes, we will need to determine what unanswered questions council has to have resolved to make a determination regarding that ordinance. And we also want to start shaping the process for implementation guidance if the ordinance passes as written. Please, if you have questions, please formulate questions from a factual and critical standpoint as opposed to from an emotional standpoint. We want to keep the discussion positive and productive. We will not attempt to answer questions this evening. Many may require research. Rather, we want to collect the questions tonight and help frame the problem. We will have scribes to accurately capture all the questions. We've got these large tablets here for that purpose. We do not intend to answer questions this evening. If there are other questions you would like to have added, we have notepads over by the door. You can write them down and put them in the middle basket. So, I think we need a motion to open the discussion. But, would someone like to start?
We begin the discussion and kind of use the John's framework here for our discussion. Second that.
I want to give credit to Nancy Fortune. It's largely her work, so
Okay.
she deserves the honor. Yes, thank you. John, would you like to start?
Well, I think we need to get this tax in place as soon as we can. And I don't know that we need to. I don't know that other than just sort of kind of fixing the technicalities in the ordinance to do it, is anything more necessary than what we have time to do tonight.
When you say technicalities in the ordinance, what?
Well, the starting dates and, all the other kinds of stuff here, when the sales tax began, et cetera.
Okay. So my recommendation, my desire, is that we go ahead and use the ordinance that was presented on December 10th and put it on the agenda next week to vote on, and then begin working through what I believe will be an incredibly difficult process of determining implementation guidance, specifically policy for how to implement the ordinance, which there's a lot involved in that.
I second and support that.
Susan, can I get your opinion?
Sure.
Yes. I think we had 1,030 people vote against it and 1,035 vote for it, correct? We represent all of those people here every day, whether you're a ward or at large. That's what we represent. I went back and looked at the margins on other initiatives. For example, the giving money to downtown. Just in 2019, the money that was left over, keeping it in downtown. It passed by a really pretty big margin, and it was kind of surprising to me in a way, because we've had a lot of discussion about tourism in downtown, and are we a visitor community or are we a resident community? But council made a unanimous decision on that, put it in front of the voters, and it looks like that was 76.70% for and 23.30% against. It's a big margin on something that might be seen as controversial. The other thing is, when you look back at the recreational marijuana, that was 64.97% for and 35.03% against. Far more controversial than this, I think. I'm really concerned about rubber stamping this and moving forward and rushing this implementation even of the ordinance, because the reality is we can't start collecting that tax until July, and there's so many unanswered questions about how to implement this, what the language even means, and how it'll happen. And I'm just going to cut right to the chase and tell you the bad things that can happen if we rubber stamp this and we just move forward as though everything's fine, we'll figure it out. This is an ordinance that can be repealed by this council, future councils down the road. It's allowed. It can be repealed, it can be replaced, it can just be repealed. That's a reality, and I want to say that out loud tonight because that's what rushing sends. I mean, you put that in people's minds. You know, when you walk down the street in your neighborhood and you can go to one house and they voted for it, and the next house and they voted against it, it's also not hard for citizens to unite on any of these sides and put petitions on the ballot. I, for one, don't want our whole year as this council to be taken up by arguing over this. I also don't want to rush into it. My ward has tremendous questions that you'll see tonight about the library, a lot of them. It's only one piece of this, and it's not a lot of money for all these organizations when you get right down to it. But I want everybody to think just for a minute about the fact that this can be repealed by future councils. It can be repealed, replaced, or repealed. I say it a lot of times because I don't want anybody to come back and say, well, I didn't know that. That's not fair, that's not allowed. It is allowed. And if we don't take the time to do this right, and we just make those 1,030 people feel like, too bad for you, we could really find ourselves in that boat, and I don't want to find us there. So that's most of what I have to say about this tonight until we get into putting specific questions on them.
So in my mind, there's not one, but two issues tonight. The first issue is passing the ordinance, and the second issue is implementing it. And, you know, I say pledge allegiance to the flag because I believe that I live in a democracy. And I may not like the outcome, and I was one of those individuals. It was probably one of the toughest votes I've ever made. However, I don't always like the outcome of elections, but I get to live with them. And it doesn't matter if an ordinance passes by 5 votes, or 50 votes, or 500 votes, it passed, and it was passed as written. That said, sometimes we get a little silver lining, and the fact that it was deferred to the new council does give us a little time. We don't have to rush into it. I agree, I don't want to wait forever and have this drag out 11 months, but the bottom line is this ordinance did pass by 5 votes. I know it's only 5 votes, but it was 5 votes. So I went out around my neighborhood and I talked to people who voted for it, and I talked to even more people who voted against it. And I will tell you, 99.9% of the people that I talked to and I got their feedback were mostly concerned with regards to issues around the library. And so I think we do have to take a look at passing it and then take a very, 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 very careful look at how we're going to implement it.
Yes, I certainly concur with everything that's been said this evening. It's easy to do that as a carryover from the prior council, because the prior council on this particular issue voted 4-3 once and 3-4 the other time. Very interesting. Representative form of government sitting up here. Basically, the council voted 50-50, not knowing how the public would vote. And the public, after a recount in many months, also voted 50-50. So that's an item that we should embrace and understand. And the second item, and this is a technicality, but one that was communicated in August by the MAC people and communicated by the Pikes Peak Bulletin after the last formal council meeting on December 17th. And that's the following. This particular initiative, because it comes with the stripe that it was council initiated, per state law, council has the ability prior to implementation to modify this ordinance Now, this particular ruling, of course, like any legal ruling, is an opinion, and an opinion is typically backed up by cases, and therein lies an area of gray when you go through and titrate all that. And perhaps next week you can get advice from our attorney exactly where that discernment lies. But I would suggest we've really moved beyond that. And when we look at the two items on the table tonight, we're devoting an hour to this, perhaps an hour and a half. There's a balance between the ordinance and the implementation. And what I would like to suggest we all think about is that, and I'm going to characterize this, as my wife likes to say to me, as the ordinance is a really big deal. So think of it as an elephant. There's a lot of complexity in the implementation of unfinished business. My wife likes to say to me, well, how do you eat an elephant? You have to eat it in bites. And regarding those bites, what I'd like to suggest is that this ordinance is actually set up 4 different types of activity, each of which may require different implementation. So let me just break that down for a moment. What could that be about? Number 1, the ordinance has in it 2 very large projects, the library and Hiawatha Gardens. These are not like doing grants to perhaps 30 nonprofits, nor is it like doing grants perhaps to the MAC, to Miramont Castle, to the Heritage Center. Why are these very different? These are very different because they are actually major developments for the city. The major development city for the process typically involves HPC reviewing a project. Does it conform to the historic district that it's in it? Also involves the planning commission review. What's the impact on the neighborhood? Is it a conditional use? Those things that are taken into account in terms of impact, being consistent with ordinances and so forth. Lastly, these projects require community engagement. And how does that come into play? Well, these projects can be done at various levels of scale, various levels of cost. So really, the ultimate delivery of a project is what's the benefit, what's the cost. We have to go through that process on these projects. It's right in our ordinances. And yes, it's covered in the higher mandate, but none of those major elements. On the other hand, the concept of grants and the fact that council has the ultimate authority, which is what the ordinance says, to do a grant or not do a grant. That particular process, actually, Matthew's had for a long time. We have a community fund, and that community fund each year has opened its treasury and is shared in recent years up to $10,000 for capital improvement for one of the constituent nonprofits. And on the seed nonprofit, contributed $5,000 to get a project going that exists just part of the summer in Stone Springs Park. Well, that grant process now has been, onesies and twosies by council. Now we're talking significantly more dollars, the more sophisticated systems needed. So what I'd like to suggest is, before we rush to do the ordinance, we think about what are the high-level implementation aspects that we should embody with this part and parcel for the delineation I just provided. And to the point of time frame, I'd like to suggest we should be able to crunch through this if we agree to break it into pieces. We could have individual teams working on each of those components I outlined. And I think we can come back in the April 15th time frame with a lot of good work done relative to the implementation. And then that implementation may or may not require a further tuning to the ordinance. Things do not need to be final really till May 1st. And we obviously want a clean start with taxes, clean communication with the state treasurer, clean communication with retailers, etc. So I would like to think that along the lines of the kinds of questions, and Nancy, thank you for the outline, that we really think through these things tonight and see how many things are open, and do we really need to, at this time, march through an ordinance which is going to be kind of a living document for a period of time until we get some of this differentiation done relative to implementation. Nothing about what I shared says anything other than, honoring the majority vote and just taking the appropriate steps on implementation. My expectation to your comments, Susan, is if we do our homework, whatever we come up with, I'm not trying to prejudge it at all, but whatever we come up with, I think just back to the original vote, we should be able to get a clean majority of council, and hopefully it's representative of our general public, because we'll have engagement along the way with these implementation groups. So that's a strategy I'd like to suggest. And basically, the order of this meeting, really come back when Mayor, you say we're reaching our time limit, come back and ask the ordinance question, but let's really delve into these examples, well thought out, that Nancy's kind of seated council with. There's a lot of meat in here. Thank you.
Well, I'm thinking of the letter to the editor that the League of Women Voters wrote to the bulletin immediately after the former council voted to not initiate the ordinance or to revert to the Department of Revenue. And it basically said that, we are a nonpartisan group, League of Women Voters, who've been around a long time. We struggle with trying to get people to bother to vote, to sign up to vote, to go out to vote. When people finally get it together to go vote, it's not right to ignore their vote. That's sending the wrong message to our citizens. We want them to vote. As it is, we only have, half the city voting or something. So whether I am happy or not happy about the ordinance, I believe with the comment that was made in the paper by the League of Women Voters is that we should respect the vote of the people, whether it's a close call or not. I also understand, and maybe this is wrong, maybe the city attorney can correct me, but it's my understanding that the ordinance as written, the way I've read it, instructs us to come up with the formula on how to divvy up this money, and there may be a formula for a building that's going to be rehabbed is obviously different from the formula to decide which nonprofit should get money and how much. But that process of coming up with a formula is something that we are tasked by the ordinance itself to do. It doesn't say we have to do it before we pass the ordinance. I mean, that's like if you're going to build a house, you don't have to stop building the house until you figure out what kind of furniture you're going to buy. That's later. First, you got to build the house. And we've been asked to pass an ordinance. I'm in favor of passing it. As John Shada mentioned, we have to change some of the wording because the ordinance says it shall begin January 1st now in terms of the money collection. Well, now we're going to have to change it to say it shall begin July 1st because that's our only choice. Fine. But other than that tweaking with dates and stuff, I don't think it's appropriate for me to change what the voters voted on. So I think we should go ahead, get it done. Doesn't matter if we work out the details. We've got plenty of time to work out the details. We're not going to get the money for a while. Even if we haven't worked out the details and the money comes in, fine. It'll sit in an interest-bearing account until we figure it out. But I'm not in favor of working out every detail on how we're going to decide who gets the money, and we have to put the whole ordinance on hold until that's done. To me, that makes no sense. It's just kind of an excuse to delay. I mean, not like an intentional bad intention or anything, but I think we should just get this thing passed, get it fixed, get it passed, and then, like Bob Todd said, go ahead and set up our groups and figure out what's the best way to hand out the money once we get it.
If I may, I didn't hear any opposition really to the ordinance. It seems to me like there's a question of timing, and then the real problem is the implementation details. So I guess I'd like to ask council, what would happen if we tabled the idea of when to vote and the exact form of the ordinance, if we just kind of hold off on that for the next portion of the meeting and talk about the implementation details and get an idea for the problem? I think that's what's scaring me, honestly to God. I don't know, maybe you all seem a lot braver than me, but I would kind of like to see us talk about what we would have to do to get those implementation details, and then maybe a little later on tonight, not too much later, we come back and see if we've decided to, if we've got a little more consensus and we would like to consider re-voting. Somebody has a better idea, I'm up for that too.
I'd just like to say that I agree with Susan and Bob with regards to, I think we're going to need to have some really robust discussions, including some more community discussions and very robust discussions on council. And also, I'm absolutely all for breaking into groups, because this ordinance has a lot of moving parts to it. I agree with that, and I also support the passing the ordinance and then rolling up our sleeves and, as John said, get to work thinking about how we're going to implement it.
Council, would you like to maybe discuss some of the problems? I mean, I don't think we have any hope of fixing things tonight. It's just to really look at the problems that are in front of us. So, would you like to do that, or seems to me that might be a worthwhile exercise to figure out how we would work out the implementation details.
What if we were to create? What if we were to create groups or committees, or just assign among us, and perhaps with any members of the public who are here today, to come up with just who's going to be working on which parts, rather than starting to just stab at fixing, like, how do we decide which nonprofit should get the money, and how do we decide if we should spend money on the library just for, in other words, just talk about which groups are going to be assigned to which projects, rather than starting to talk about the specific problems. I'm done.
Yeah, I think that if we tried to do that tonight, we would go down rabbit holes. And one of the things that we put on the next steps would be a facilitated meeting with City Council with a highly skilled, very objective facilitator to come in and help us take the questions that we may or may not get to tonight, to totally frame the issue, and to come up with a appropriate process by which to develop the implementation guidance. I have to agree with John. I think, as I've shared, I think that that's where the real meat of this whole issue is. It's in the implementation guidance, not in the ordinance at this point. Yes, I know that there are troubling things. You know, there are different viewpoints on the ordinance. I clearly understand that, but I think ultimately that this is the path we're on. So I would recommend that we not get into decisions or trying to determine the future at this point, other than to say we either do or do not pass the ordinance, and then work very hard with a skilled facilitator to figure out how we are going to implement that. Because I don't know that any of us at this table have all of the answers, and we need someone who can help take our collective ideas about it and coalesce that into something. And I know Denise will help us a great deal on that as well, but I think we need to do that so that we don't go down a rabbit hole and we don't start disagreeing with one another right off the bat.
Who do you want to hire?
I don't know the answer to that. I have no concept of good facilitators within the area, but I'm sure Denise has some points of contact out there that she could seek.
How much is it going to cost? I don't know.
really, or a full day, 8-hour facilitator, you're probably looking at $2,000 or so. If you're looking at 2 hours, that's very different.
My sense is it would be well worth the efficiencies to be gained by that would be well worth the expense.
It works, it works. So, I mean, one thing we could do is there's 11 questions that you guys put together, but I suppose we could maybe send questions that we have that aren't on here, perhaps to John, to the mayor. And then those questions could be put forth to a facilitator, and that would include questions that we have gotten from our constituents that might not be one of these 11 or covered by these 11. And that would kind of take what you're wanting to do is sort of make sure we don't just scoot over these issues, but there's probably not a lot that's going to come out of tonight throwing them on the wall or arguing about them. But if your question isn't on here, maybe you can formulate that. And I don't know if that's the appropriate way to do it. I'm throwing that out as an example. Nancy, it looks like you might have a...
Our thought was when we were trying to look at this, this is the result of about 2 minutes worth of thinking of questions. There are millions of questions out there, and we thought that Denise and Roy would, or Denise and Judy, whomever, would scribe tonight and actually just start capturing as many. I mean, we all have a million questions about this. There are just there's a lot to be worked through. So if we could just start capturing all those questions to start working on, not answer them tonight because we don't have the expertise necessarily in the room to answer them, but start capturing them, that would help frame the process by which we would need to go down and to actually frame the problems that we're going to need to address in the future. So that was.
You want to do some of that tonight?
I think that would be.
I would be in favor of doing some of that tonight.
I'd be in favor of doing that. I think just outlining at a very high level where we're going would be good. But what I hear is, I think jumping in and getting more of these questions is a great first step for us to do immediately. I think the question about a facilitator and all of us going through everything will prove to be inefficient. I would rather, once we get all the questions up, see if we can come back and say, let's get council working. We can work up to 2 council members on a subgroup and assign a group, for example, to work on the ordinance. That's a distinct thing to be done. Get a group assigned to work on the library kinds of questions. Get a group, the Hiawatha kinds of questions. Get a group, how do we handle the 66% tub of grants that go beyond those projects? It's 3 organizations. And then the last group is how do we handle I don't have a good label for it, but the group of 30, I'll just call it that, nonprofits. And to me, again, I really think putting a deadline in front of us relatively quick so this does not drag out, but just very efficient. When these groups come back, we can have a facilitator to get the whole council moving on things. And then this puts the last thing of this evening, the ordinance that puts it into, a minor period of suspense, perhaps not. But again, 2 people working on the ordinance and refining it could be a good thing to do. So, that's what I'd like to suggest. And so the first step right now would just be whack away at the flip charts and the questions we have and just see what comes up.
I like Councilman Todd's idea of taking some time tonight and trying to look at the problems, trying to put it together. As far as getting a facilitator, that might be a good idea. Um, I think this is a pretty smart group of people here. I think we could make some progress tonight. And I'd like to give that a try. We could, if we decide we want to do a facilitator, that would be probably okay. But you know, the first thing the facilitator is going to do is come out with flip charts and ask us what our problems are. So I think we could get a start on that now. I mean, I'd be willing to try that. Do we have, Susan? Okay. We're all good with that? Okay, so we've rented this discussion here for about a half an hour in. How about we take 20 minutes and just write down problems and start to try and frame the size of the problem, how we might be able to work through it. And then as we come up on the hour, we'll see if we want to entertain schedule a vote, or if we want to schedule more kind of a workshop thing and address the problems. Is that agreeable? Okay, great. Okay, well, all right, let's go around here and we'll all take turns asking questions. And Denise and Roy, we're going to see how fast you can write. Susan, would you like to start off?
Sure, I will start off. I would like more information from the Park Street Library District, which owns our library, on how they plan on using it. Oh, gosh, sorry. I'll get this on my last.
Thanks. I would like more information from PPLD about their plans for the expanded space. So that's a big question. There's things that are more specific. They pay us rent for the building. How much will that rent be when there's an expansion is a good question. What are they planning to do with those spaces? Are they bringing in extra staff? So I haven't seen in any of the information that's come out much information from PPLD on how this is going to be utilized, staffed. Will we end up with a building with locked rooms for most of the day? I just don't know. I don't know that that'll happen, but there's a lot of questions about that. The other question that I've gotten is, how does expanding the library fit into the resolution that we recently passed about green cities? There are shortages of sand for construction worldwide, and there are buildings that are existing that we already need to fix. So I'd like some more study about how this matches up with this idea that those 17 points and that resolution about being a greener city, how doing new construction fits that. That's a couple of the really big ones I think that I have. I don't think we understood much in the information that's in the packet. The 52 pages did not address this at all. Most pictures that we saw before didn't even show the library expansion. It showed the old building. And the other thing is that we're talking about broadband and we're talking about 5G a lot. We did a lot of that the last 2 years, and I'd like to know what that does to libraries in the future. Because I've had a number of citizens tell me maybe everybody should just, Manatee should become an internet provider and there should be a tablet program. And there's also, I'd like us to look into a partnership with our needs that are being stressed for this expansion. How can the school district maybe partner with us? I'd like for us to reach out to the school district and have a conversation about that, to see if there's some synergy there for some mutual use that doesn't require an expansion. These are questions that I just would like to have answered. These are a lot of questions that came out of my ward. It's not even necessarily a yes or no on the expansion, but these are things, without knowing these things, people feel really like they can't make a decision.
So can I just paraphrase to make sure this is all library questions, is my understanding, correct? So how much rent will willing to pay for the facility availability during the day, nights, Green Cities Library, how that fits in, 5G impact libraries, maybe a tablet program, looking at some of those, and school district partnership mutual use may not require expansion.
Right, and it's more than just the rent that PPLD, that's a small thing. Surely they've got to have a plan for an expanded space, staff-wise, materials-wise, availability. What are those rooms? that they're gonna do. Are they meeting rooms, are they media rooms? I don't know. I just don't know the information on that.
Okay,
Thank you.
so that's library. Laura, you get the next one.
Yeah, if I might suggest, it seems like maybe we're getting some rhythm going here. If we just go around in a circle here, why don't we try to stick to the library first, and then we'll come back and we'll try the next topic. That's agreeable, folks? I think it'll help us focus on the topic. And I gather you're going to pass on the library? Okay.
Oh, I want to talk about the library, or I have something else.
Okay, I guess one of the questions I've heard from constituents is the library expansion, how big is it really, and does it need to be that big? Do we just need to fix put in modern bathrooms and make it ADA compliant and some basic maintenance? Or do we want what's been proposed? So I guess maybe we need to get that out and see what folks want. In my mind, that's sort of like having a plan A and a plan B, a biggie size and then a more modest approach.
Okay, so I'm curious if the library is expanded, what if any additional parking needs there will be so that people can go there without walking? I mean, maybe that's not necessary, I don't know, but I think we should look at parking if we're gonna expect a lot more people using the space.
I have a question that does impact the library, and it's part of my need to know more about capital expenditures versus operational expenditures, because there's 5 entities here, and some will need large capital expenditures, and some will need more operational expenditures. And so, to me, as we work in our groups, I'd like more clarity on what can we move forward from an operational standpoint to get some of these things going. In other words, when we get all together, where do we have big areas of agreement where we can move forward, and where do we really need to pause and step back and take a look at it? Again, of the people that I've talked to, and I've tried to talk to everybody that I run into, I've asked them what if you voted against it, why, and if you voted for it, do you have issues? And the number 1 issue was regarding the library, and the number 2 issue was Hiawatha Gardens, which we'll get to. And so, and I think, Susan, this is Susan's ward, and I think that it's important that we particularly hear from people that most impacted. I really also like what Susan said about what are the libraries of the future looking like, because how are they going to be brick and mortar? So that's a big question for me, my main question. So, but also capital versus operational expenditures is a big, huge question mark for me.
Yeah, I'd like to follow your comment about the capital first. And with respect to that, both the library and both Hiawatha are city-owned facilities, as we know. The city is responsible for the health, welfare, and the safety, health, and welfare of our community. Our buildings should be safe, healthy, and for the general welfare. These are large dollars. We will not be able to begin either project, they're city-owned, without the city doing bonding to support that. We can't pay them out just a stream of sales tax dollars. We have to have an underlying capital nut. And so regarding that capital nut, which is what you were referring to, I think it's important before proceeding with either that our city administrator brief council on the status of our capital plan. We have a capital plan. Not all the pieces are funded, nor do you expect to be able to fund all your capital at once. You have to do it over time. But for example, there's a pressing need on City Hall. There's a pressing need, health and safety and welfare of our city employees. to be the most productive they could be, to have appropriate housing, but we don't have the capital for that squared away. That's just an example. So, question is, what's the status of the overall capital plan of the city, and how do these projects fit into them? How much money can we raise? We may find ourselves capital constrained. We're looking at the coal basket. So that belongs is a area to be dwelt into. Then I want to come back to just focusing on the library. For a project of this sort, the good news is the prior council ensured that money that had gotten commingled in the general fund was really intended to be tagged for the library, has now been retagged or reserved for the library. So it's $300,000 available of funds to get the library project moving. So how do you move a big project? You'd like to have a project manager who is really scripting the whole project out. So, and then we need to identify a project manager. We have the funding, and what's the project manager going to do? The project manager is going to come up with, well, what's the schedule? You know, HPC has looked at the largest expansion possible. Planning Commission is now before them. What's the schedule for that? What does the Planning Commission require? Big questions. To the mayor's question about the scale, the project manager ideally would be able to say, if you put $100,000 into the library, here's how we can address ADA, this is how we can address circulations through the library, this is how we can address for handicapped people right from parking through the library, how to get to it. There's a level of what's the amount of expansion. So this requires professional diligence to get cost estimates and so forth. Ultimately, you want to get to an RFP. Ultimately, you want to get to a date of breaking ground. So this needs to be worked in parallel before we can talk sensibly about implementation for this bucket under the ordinance that was approved. So, Roy, I don't know if that capture.
So, what was the question? Is
So I'll recap it. The city's
capital
plan. The city's capital plan, where do these projects fit into it? How are we going to approach bonding? On the library, who's the project manager? What's the budget for the project manager when the city controls the $300,000? What is the work plan for the project manager? What's their schedule?
Executive Bob?
Yes.
Okay, I have another issue. With respect to the library, is this on? With respect to the library, I would like to know, with respect to the plans that were drawn already, and I guess an architect would have to answer this, whether it's feasible or practical to take the project in pieces and start with making it ADA compliant and then deal with expansion later, just to see if it's the kind of, I mean, I'd hate to do that if it means wasting money and undoing the ADA compliant work at the time if and when there's an expansion, but it'd be nice to know if we could do it along the way. And the other thing is, my other concern was in terms of staff time necessary to implement the ordinance. I just assumed that the Rick James money that you were referring to, the $300,000, could be used to either hire or supplement one of the staff people, because this is going to take a lot of oversight. And I thought the James money might be a good source for that, since I don't think the ordinance provides for any of the collected money to be used for oversight, but I don't know the answer to that.
If it's all right, why don't we move on to nonprofits? And maybe if we can, again, just go around and give ourselves maybe 5 minutes or so, maybe make a piece. Susan, would you like to start? Or if you want to wait. Who would? Okay. Right. Okay. We'd like to start off on nonprofits, then, the nonprofit section.
I would just say, for the nonprofits, I would just say that we look at whatever the normal grant or review process is, and what many of those criteria are already identified in this list. But just take a look at what would a normal RFP look like if they're trying to decide who should get the money. You're not going to give money to a group that has never existed before and has no community backing and no hope for the future. But rather than reinventing the wheel, we could just find out what criteria tends to be reviewed when people have money to give out. Lots of resources in town to get the answer to that.
You would like to go next with nonprofits.
Further question? That's a good point. And maybe I should know the answer to this, but I don't. Is it a use it or lose it? If I'm the mayor of Mount Castle, can I not use my money this year but get twice as much next year? Or do I need to use it all this year? And I'm not picking on the council, I just picked their name out of the hat.
I would imagine that would be part of the contract. We would say, if you get this money, here's the plan. You have to follow your proposal that you submitted as to how it's going to be used, when it's going to be used, and so forth, and account to us and send us the paperwork so we know you're on schedule and blah, blah, blah. We're going to do a site visit. But along those lines, it's my understanding also that council could just say, let's hold these monies for the next 24, 36 months. Let's just let them grow and grow, and then we'll decide how to use it. We're not mandated to dish out every penny every year. And we're not mandated to necessarily expand the library. We're not mandated to do bond funds and all of this for the library. We could hold the money for the next 10 years and pay for it ourselves or whatever. That's my understanding. I don't know if that's right.
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's good comments. I think one of the things we want to do is focus on problems, identifying. And I will take the opportunity here to basically plagiarize Nancy's work. Under examples, I think she has 6 really good ones that apply to nonprofits. So Roy, I'm going to read these out. Why don't you just write the numbers down and we'll transcribe them later. 1, how would the determination be made if funds are used for if the funds will be used for capital needs or programmatic needs? Will one have priority over the other? 2, should we require that matching funds be required to receive any funds?
You want these all written?
No, just if you'll just write 1 and 2 down, we'll transcribe by reference. No,
Actually write it down?
no, just write the number down.
Oh,
So we'll know, and then I'll give you this at the end of the night.
Okay.
You'll have it, so we can, no need to do unnecessary work. And then question 6, if you have a copy of the sheet, what criteria will be used to select nonprofits for receipt of funds? Question 7, will nonprofits be required to submit their budgets? 8, will there be an audit of the funds? 9, what will happen if one of the nonprofits identified in the initiative goes belly up? So Roy, that would be 1, 2, 6, 7, 8, and 9 off the sheet. I believe those are pretty germane for nonprofits. And I think several of those together indicate that we're looking for financial due diligence on the part of the city relative to the nonprofits. Who's next on nonprofits?
I would, and this is probably broader than just nonprofits, but how would we want to engage the community in developing the implementation guidance? And more specific to the nonprofits, would the common grant process be appropriate for us to use as a basis of template for this? Thank you.
sorry, what was your second one?
With the Common Grant process, I believe that's the name of it. The
The Colorado Common Grant.
Process be a good template for us to use.
Well,
Go ahead. So the ordinance specifically addresses the Manitou Art Center, the Manitou Heritage Center, and the Miramont Castle Museum. So my question is, how do we engage these three particular nonprofits who have indicated they have capital improvement needs as well as operational needs, and so that we can rank order what's most important to keep these nonprofits functional. For example, the Manitou Art Center has indicated that it needs HVAC repair on both of its buildings. So I would like to hear back from these nonprofits. What are the things that you need to stay open, to be operational in order to function, and then how can we then support you in the operational functions? So again, engaging with the nonprofits to let us know what their most immediate needs, and then we can decide, is that a capital improvement issue or is that an operational issue? And I think that'll make our work a little bit easier as we go forward. How you get that into a question, but
engage
it
with
really,
nonprofits
we need
for
to
immediate
engage,
needs.
because they'll be able to tell us, hey, this year, it's kind of like the city, this building, I mean, it has to have HVAC repair at some point. So what do these nonprofits tell us they need that's the most immediate, and give a rationale and give us some background feedback, and then moving forward, once we have solid, capital improvements with these nonprofits, then we can move forward in their operation goals.
Understand you correctly, are you asking for a ranking system? Are you saying we need to rank those, or we need someone to rank them? I don't know if I'm understanding it correctly.
So just mainly it's an engagement question about how do we engage with these nonprofits that are indicated in the ordinance that we engage with, and what are their most immediate needs, and then we can take a look at, let's say, the Miramont Castle, it's definitely repairs and capital improvements versus operational, and then how does that segue into the capital fund, for example? Did that answer your question?
We have two items. One item is that of particularly the 30 nonprofits or emerging nonprofits. I'd like to suggest that we consider having an advisory board to review these applications and make recommendations to council. Now, where does that recommendation come from? To a degree, the MAC initiative is modeled after the Denver Art Tax. You may be familiar with the Denver Art Tax. It involves 7 counties around Denver. And what is true about that tax or that board, the actual implementation is done by a group that's appointed by elected officials. So elected officials appoint a group to administer that. I think scaling it down to just the small city of Manitou, we should think about the analogy to that, which is we as council appoint an advisory board that would be an eclectic group of citizens, not appended to any particular organization, but who bring in a functional perspective that's respected in the community. It could be a social services person, an art person, it could be an environmental person, etc. Because if you think of the 30 nonprofits, they all have or generating missions that tend to have something in those sectors. And so you'd have this eclectic board of people. We've got some great resources, former mayors, former council people, former board and commission people who aren't interested in serving any further in that type of process. Then we got standing individuals to be appointed to this board. So advisory board question to handle recommendation recommendations to council. So council is not being, use the negative term, politic for a particular cause, but there's actually a board that's recommending based on their unique roles in the community.
So is your question, should we model our process after the Denver process? I just think it's helpful to coalesce it into a
Number one,
question.
that should be looked at, but I'd say my looking at it, but one big takeaway is having an advisory board. The other things can be looked at.
So that's a pro solution as opposed to a question.
No, it's a question. Should we have the advisory board is supposedly he's coming directly with the council. And then I'd like to go back to the question of capital and operating expense, which is, should we limit for the large institutions, Miramont Castle and MAC, the large institutions, should we limit their funding to only capital and not be subsidizing operating expenses? I think they present a different breed than subsidizing operating expenses may not be necessary. Presumably the operations are sustainable. The big challenge is the capital, not like the city's facing the capital without buildings. So I think that question can be narrowed down to that group. So that's a question.
No.
Everybody raise a hand on topics. It's all right, let's go to the mini grants. Does that sound like a fair topic? Anybody want to start off?
Just for labeling, mini grants is what I was referring to with the advisory boards.
Okay, I was
Yeah, sorry.
thinking nonprofits.
For nonprofits, mini grants.
Okay, I was thinking
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just thinking of when you were talking there, Bob, I was thinking the three bigger nonprofits, the MAC, the Heritage Center, and the Historical Society. But
I apologize for that.
No,
I meant the 30.
your attempts with
30 who would be receiving mini grants.
the mini grants, okay.
33% of the board is collecting funds.
Okay. So I guess, Roy, if you could repeat if you could put mini grants as well.
30, the 30 of the nonprofits, 33% get the mini grants.
Right.
And that's what you're looking for advisory for.
And the other question was, should we limit, as I heard it from Bob, should we limit them to just capital, or the three large ones, or four, whatever it is, should we limit to only capital versus programmatic?
That's an interesting, Nancy, that's an interesting distinction. Maybe there's capital programs and operating expenses. So maybe a program initiative is like Hatchet, if you would, a startup nonprofit. I think that's a good, to me, those three stripes to look at. For the three organizations.
Can I ask a question about the ordinance? It's a little off topic. My question, it's my understanding the ordinance said that with respect to the 1/3 of money to the various nonprofits for mini grants, that it just said nonprofits that deal in the arts, pertaining to the arts. I didn't think it said you have to give money to this particular nonprofit. Am I correct?
Well, I think we've been talking about them somewhat interchangeably, which is a great point. We've been talking about the nonprofits being the Miramont Castle, the MAC, and the Heritage, whatever it is, Center, thank you, versus the smaller nonprofits that don't have capital, they don't have buildings. So we've got the three nonprofits that have buildings, and we have all the other nonprofits that may come in looking for some funding. So they wouldn't be needing capital. They, in all likelihood, wouldn't be needing capital.
So,
Hello?
So with respect to the smaller nonprofits then, it's my understanding that there's a certain percentage of the money that may be allocated to those groups, but it doesn't say you have to allocate it to this particular group as one of them, correct? And therefore, number 9 is irrelevant? Or am I missing something? What will happen if one of the nonprofits is belly up? Well, if it's belly up, it's probably not going to be submitting a request for money.
Yeah.
So I don't understand that question.
Actually, when I wrote that, I was intending it more for the match, or for the 3 ones with buildings. So, you know, a question could be, if the city invested in them inside, you know, I don't think this is possible, but just say, if the city were to invest significant tax dollars into them, and then abruptly they would belly up, although we should know that before because we would hopefully have lots of financials on them. You know, and once they dissolve, as a nonprofit dissolves, would any of that money, where would that money go? And would the city have any claim to any of it?
Oh, like if the city were to make a deal that says, we'll give you money to improve your building if we become the co-owner of the building, that kind of thing. Is that what you're,
Well,
or
again,
just anything?
wide open, wide
Okay.
open. It's just,
Thank you.
there are concepts, there's so many concepts out there that we could go down so many different avenues. So narrowing the focus of all of this is our challenge.
And my understanding was that when Nancy wrote that down, that she was looking at a way to protect the city, so that we wouldn't, you know, waste money. That could be worked out, I think. Okay, are we good to go on with mini grants? Who wants to start?
I like the idea of Bob's suggestion about an advisory board, and I would think that if we made it annual, so you came on board once a year to do that, then we'd probably have a good look at getting volunteers, because it would be a really long-term commitment, and it would pull people from all aspects of the community to help make those decisions. I think that'd be great. I don't know enough about the mini grants right now to ask more questions.
The mini grants shouldn't be too complicated. I know, like, for example, the Manitou Springs Education Foundation gives out mini grants. They collect money from their fundraisers and give it. I mean, there are plenty of places that give out money for mini grants that could either advise our advisory group or be part of the advisory group on how to responsibly handle giving out this kind of money. I think we've got a lot of resources.
Yeah, I think the MAC committee have given a significant amount of thought to the mini grants, so I would probably look to them for some ideas I have relative to having a community advisory board, which I think is a good idea. Do we have anything else for the mini grants? Okay, so we're a little over, a few minutes over an hour. I would still like to go around and talk about Hiawatha Garden, just briefly, and then I guess there's 2 questions remaining. Do we want to schedule a vote, or when do we see that happen? That could be, I think, anytime from next week till early May. And then do we feel, where do we want to go with this process, which is probably the bigger question. So who'd like to lead off on Hiawatha Gardens? No takers?
Not a question, but a fact, is that the Hiawatha Gardens group is coming in on February 11th to give a brief, which will hopefully answer some questions for folks, and more questions could be asked at that point. It wouldn't, they're not briefing on the ordinance per se, but just on Hiawatha Gardens in general.
I think that's a good point. I don't see that it's really very fruitful to speculate on Hiawatha Gardens until the groups had a chance to come in and present their information. So I'd be inclined to defer till at least the 11th of February and then pick it up from there. Anything else on Hiawatha?
I think just like Nancy identified that milestone also the mobility study. It's going to come before council at work session, and then kind of to approve the study, although it doesn't have an action plan in terms of what we're investing. But Hiawatha Gardens gets wrapped into the mobility study because of the parking garage question and the actual use of the land and property. Plus, we have another interested party commitment, which is from the COG agreement. We have a commitment of $500,000 toward our transportation needs, with also a goodwill gesture that, depending upon the nature of the project that we come up with, the COG may be interested in putting even more capital into it. So, to your point, John, there's a lot more. The library's been pretty sussed out as a project at a global level. Just one footnote on that. The architect who did that design, I believe he's a one-man shop. He was an expert at Carnegie Library conversions. He's passed away. So we're also going to really need to have an architect to help us pick up where he left off with these architectural questions, in addition to a program manager. But so back to the garage. It does make sense to suspend much at the garage. Hiawatha Gardens, it makes sense to suspend the conversation until we get through February 11th. But there's a lot of milestones that are coming up to get there.
Anything more on Hiawatha for tonight? Okay, so I guess now it's a question to council. How do we feel about what we've done so far? We've begun to ask questions. I think probably some of the questions we have tonight, we're pretty close to having answers in some cases. There are probably some of the audience who have answers. We won't ask those tonight. We ask for those answers tonight. We could get a facilitator. I think we could probably organize some of these things and work it ourselves before we start spending money. Thoughts? What's your pleasure?
Is the question on whether we're moving forward with a vote? Is that?
Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, let's not talk about the vote just yet. I think the situation is we're not feeling comfortable with how we deal with the problem. If we were to vote for it and it passed, then we've really got a lot of work to do. Okay, but I think that could be fun work, and that's what we've been talking about here.
I wasn't sure what the question was.
I'm sorry. I'll try to be clear.
And I would disagree. I personally would like to see us vote as soon as possible, understanding that the council can always repeal it at some point in time too, so I do understand the risks. I think the community has voted, whether it's a divided vote or not, it's still a vote. And I just don't want to delay this. I want to get moving on this. And so I would prefer to vote next week.
Well,
I feel better about that now, knowing that we are going to really dig in our heels and have these robust conversations and have facilitators. So I feel good about moving forward with passing the ordinance. And I really, from what I've heard tonight, really feel confident that we can come together and as your public servants and do the best that we can to allocate those funds based on what the community needs and desires.
John, are we on the topic of the ordinance?
Well, my thought was we were talking about how we're going to solve the problem. Again, this sort of this vacuous, this abstract business of working through the problems, trying to come up with implementation guidelines. Basically taking these questions, somehow organizing them, aligning them with each of the four major topics that we've got and figuring out how do we work through this in a reasonable amount of time. Do we need a facilitator? A number of the questions we've asked here, I think we've probably got resources already that if they don't give us answers, I think they would at least help us refine the question. I think we have at least partial answers here. So my inclination would be to try to pursue those things before we start spending money on a facilitator. I mean, if we bring a facilitator in, fine, but let's articulate our questions as much as possible so we make the most of their time and ours. that would be my thought.
So to take your thought and I would suggest to just crunch it down to one level for the level of pragmatism. We were to decide now to team up council members, two council members on an aspect of this. And we would know who in general to engage in the community for input, as you pointed out. And we were to give those groups a period of time to come back and report, then we would have more meat on the bones of these questions in each sector with thought. And then at that juncture, we could decide how then to proceed. We would have enough structure, perhaps, to say yes, facilitator, or to say, no, let's continue to go down this path. So I would like to suggest, if we follow your inclination, that we divide into teams, and that we have a date certain for those teams to come back and report on, what they found, how these questions are flushing out, what the preliminary thoughts are, and, done in collaboration with the MAC proponents and done in collaboration with citizens that have concerns. And let people know who they are. Here's two council members that are working on this. If you have input, pop them an email, give them a call. People who are vested in it will, show up.
Council, what do you think of that idea?
Are you wanting that prior to the vote on the ordinance? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Because John said the discussion we're having right now is on facilitator, global meeting, next step, or next step breaking some pieces and getting basically reports back to council.
Yeah, I guess if we could decide how we want to pursue the problems, the questions, what we do with that. And then if we get a little direction on that, then I'd like to pull you all. We've kind of done it already, but I'd like to pull you on the vote. Okay, so we'll come back to that. That should go pretty quickly. Well, what if we did, pair up into groups and we each took one of those 4 topics and worked on it for a month and came back, and then we would have the freedom to get with people in the community and try to work the issue. And at that point, maybe we decide we need to bring in a facilitator. John.
It seems like what we have before us is about $400,000 a year, which is not even 3% of the budget this council's responsible for. So I think we ought to kind of put this into a context that 400,000, the measure dictates a certain apportionment in essentially 2 different funds. One's $264,000 a year, if we believe the $400,000 number, and the other is $136,000 for awards and grants. I don't think this is a lot of money. It seems like to me that we ought to appoint a well thought out advisory board, have a look at these 2 buckets of money, okay, and come up with a framework. Look at what maybe other communities have done and give us some recommendations after a short period of time. I'd like to move ahead on the ordinance because I have a little bit of heartburn that we didn't get it in place by January 1st, okay? And I realized there were probably some administrative, there were vote recounts, there was all sorts of who knows what that I don't necessarily think is important to kind of delve into it because we didn't make the deadline to basically be in the state sales tax system. So I think we ought to get the ordinance in place, get that funding flow, essentially that the Department of Revenue knows we want that in place, as soon as possible, given how this is set up. Get an advisory board set up, get them kind of operating on these 2 pots of money, okay? Then the next thing I think this council ought to agree to do, which is we have a facility which is a public library, which right now is not ADA accessible. And I think this council ought to take that on as a whole separate thing than this rubric, okay? All right? That is something we are responsible for doing under federal law, seeing that our facilities are accessible, okay? And I think we ought to, you know, in particular, task another advisory board or the staff or whatever to say, how can we get that library ADA accessible as soon as we can, okay? Not necessarily as efficiently as we can, because maybe the efficiently as we can is 15 years off, and I don't think that's the spirit of ADA. That's what my suggestion would be.
Thank you. I really like that suggestion on both counts. We had previously talked about setting up some sort of an advisory group to do this. On one hand, I like the idea of council being heavily engaged. On the other hand, I think it might be better if we're not the ones doing the initial proposal on how it goes forward. I would suggest that perhaps in 2 weeks at our next work session, we look at who might be appropriate to appoint. So I like that idea. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
What if we were to appoint an advisory board for the 2/3 bucket of money on the buildings, and then a different advisory board to deal with the, whatever they're called, small grants or whatever, the awards and grants, so that we have 2 different groups working on 2 completely different things. We might even solicit input from the community, including people who couldn't make it here tonight, to see if anyone would like to be on that board and feels that they are qualified, if they'd like to step forward, if there was some kind of public service announcement or something in the newspaper or something, see if people could come in and send their names in and see which of these 2 pots of money they'd like to be on the board for, and have them provide us with guidance. What John Shada said makes sense to me, that we're dealing with just 3% of our entire budget. We can't put a huge investment of time into such a tiny little thing. It's so important, and as Bob Todd and some others have mentioned here today, we've got lots of wonderful people in the community who can give us good advice.
Anybody else?
I think the idea of the 2 boards is great, the mini grant group. I think the other group, 2/3 of the money, I do believe that we need to separate the projects from the grants to the 3 institutions. They're very different animals, very different animals. And so what we could have, maybe Denise's thoughts would be helpful on this, we could have a capital advisory group that would take under its mandate these 2 city-owned facilities, the library and Hiawatha Gardens, and the things that were previously discussed about them, and have their scope include the full city's capital plan. And these would be people who would be thinking bonding, they'd be thinking priority, they'd be thinking phasing, etc. They'd be thinking how do you get to the planning commission, these types of things. That's kind of one animal. And then a different animal in that 66% are grants to these institutions, very different animals. Miramont, Dale Mill Building, Mac Dillon Building, they both have very large investments in building. Heritage Center, not so much. And then that group can look at, which bucket or set of rules does the Heritage Center work with, the mini grant one or the something similar to Miramont and the other. So I'd like to just suggest 3 groups, and then if that one group, your administration standpoint, like you want to be you'd like to have that adjunct to have the
We would have to really flesh it out of what the responsibilities would be, but I think that's something we can definitely look at.
Well, okay, we're coming up on, we're well over an hour now, but we originally, initially, it talked about doing this for an hour and a half. I think this was time well spent. I guess now what I'd like to do, it's probably pretty simple to get a feel for whether or not we want to have this on the agenda next week, the 21st, for a vote. I do want to respect, the half of the community that is probably leery about some of this. Maybe it's more than half the community. So do we have confidence that we can work through this and hammer out all the issues? Again, two sides of a similar coin.
I'm in favor of having I'm in favor of having the ordinance revised so that the dates are correct. I think it has to say commencing July 1, 2020 in terms of when the funds will begin being collected, and that we start it immediately. Vote on it next meeting and schedule the second reading thereafter.
John, I think you're of a similar persuasion. And Nancy?
Yes.
Judith? Okay.
The ordinance that we have in front of us was done on the QT between December 10th and December 17th. December 10th was to have been a work session, it turned out to be a formal meeting to approve it. I think the ordinance should reflect the gist also of what we're talking about here. Key takeaways for me are this open-ended right now implementation thing. We should have a definitive date saying we will strive best efforts basis to have the implementation sorted out by April 15th. I think we should have that in this ordinance. The ordinance does not have to precisely mirror the ballot initiative. It can expand it. And I think the other thing that should be in there is this concept of appointing three advisory boards in the flavor we just talked about. We should have that in the ordinance.
Why?
Because it's all related to the progress of moving forward in a transparent and a clear manner, so our community understands the schedule we're on and has an idea of how we're going to approach the implementation. It's all part of communications. I think that's something that's been emphasized in some of our notes, that we want to really make sure this time we really communicate thoroughly. So the ordinance is a good tool for doing that. It communicates to ourselves what our commitment is, and it lets the community know what we're putting ourselves to be accountable for as a city. That's why I would put those 2 points in. I wouldn't just do a carbon copy. I would push the envelope a little bit, because we all benefit by pushing ourselves a little bit on this at this point. Especially if we have a consensus. I mean, if we have a consensus that says, yeah, for this amount of money that John highlighted of the budget, we shouldn't be, allowing ourselves to take more time than May 15th. The concept of an advisory board, I think we're pretty honed in on that. So let's get that out there and have that part of the ordinance. It establishes another advisory board that kicks off that process. So in our city code, where we have our advisory boards listed, this will become another. It was not chapter, but it will become another board, and get ourselves working on that, so we have the qualifications moving forward as a board.
Bob, I respect what you're saying, and I think you got some good ideas there. I guess my personal preference would be to pass an ordinance that is probably pretty close to what council looked at back in December. And my thought there is, the more we change it from over time, I think maybe we look like we're getting away from the spirit of what people voted for. Whether they were sure what they were voting for, because there are a lot of vague things about that. I think we kind of want to honor the voters. That would be my thought. That we could do another ordinance, I think, as far as implementing.
Well, the debate point becomes, just kind of taking your own observation, by putting, you referred to there being vagueness in it, ordinance, now there's going to be vagueness Yeah, we're a group of 7, and majority vote absolutely carries. However we come out of that Tuesday.
I hear 4 people, and I would be willing to vote on it next week. So I think we should go ahead and put the ordinance on the agenda for next week. And I think we should modify it as needed, just to get the dates and so forth. That is not, in my mind, a perfect solution. I'm sensitive to what the rest of the community wants. I think we need to hammer that out. There's a lot of work to be done there. But I think we could probably do that okay.
I'm all for having a vote. I'm just suggesting what the content be, that's all.
Right. Any other thoughts on that?
Yes. I am in favor of passing the ordinance, which is close to the language as it was put forth before the voters, with the obvious changes that we need to make with regards to when the tax will be collected, which will then be July 1st. And then moving forward with, the ordinance clearly states that the city council, will be responsible for allocating those funds. And I don't think we need to put any of that particular language in this ordinance. I think that I agree with 2 advisory boards, they're fantastic. I agree with John's excellent recommendation to move forward in the short term to look at the Carnegie Library being ADA compliant. And I think those are the things that the citizens of Manitou want us to move forward with. I just recommend them pass it in as close to the language as it was originally voted on, with those obvious changes that we need to make.
Okay, I think we've got some direction for next week and for the ordinance. We still have the hard work to do, is to figure out how to spend it. I guess I would ask staff if you could compile the list of questions, and we'll include it in next week's council packet and bring it back for. Would it be okay if we brought it back for discussion at the work session 2 weeks from tonight? Would council be okay with that? Or do we want to do something fast sooner? We're all good with that? So if we could have just some typed up notes, and we'll come back to it again.
I would encourage anyone in the public to do 3x5 cards if they have additional questions.
Right, okay, so, yeah, there are cards or notepads over there. If you remember the audience, please, if you want to put questions in there, please do it. I recognize a number of faces out there, and I think you may be asked questions as assistants at some point. Okay. Oh, yeah, actually, good idea. You take it.
I was just gonna say, if anybody out there wants to also fill out a card with your name and contact info, if you're interested in being on either of these advisory boards, we'd like to know.
Okay, any additional comments on this topic tonight? Okay, great. Does anybody want to take a break? Okay, the next topic is pretty short. Next item, business update and confirmation on retreat goals and objectives. Denise, if you would give us an update.
So January 25th, you guys have agreed to do a full day retreat. So the way we're going to manage it right now is from 9 to about 11:30. The executive director of CML is coming down to really talk about responsibility goals and his experience with working with council. He's a phenomenal wealth of information, and he's coming down to do that. Then we will take pictures so that we can get your group picture and get individual pictures taken. And then we'll do a quick lunch, and then we have a facilitator that is highly recommended by Kevin, who is the executive director of CML, and who has worked with numerous other cities to really work on the afternoon of conduct or standards of conduct that you will agree upon. She will then go write it up. We'll have a resolution, and you will pass it, and it will be a resolution that will be passed down from this point forward on code of conduct
or standards of conduct for city council members. So that is that day. I'm sorry, we'll be at the Garden of God's Trading House. Yes, thank you.
Do you have any further comments or questions on that?
One comment is, we kicked off something similar in 2018. That's how I look at our service. There's a drag as a result of that, which it's with insurance. So there is the
Our self-insurance.
yes.
Good.
So just a question on that.
Yeah, she has a copy of that. And this facilitator works with CERSA exclusively, so she has a lot of experience working with CERSA. These things they have done. This code of conduct.
So with that.
Yeah.
I don't remember her name, but the attorney who is the executive director now of CERSA, she has an excellent article online. I've only read about half or three-quarters of it. It looked like a summary of a PowerPoint of a presentation she made just this past July on advice for cities, legal advice for cities on what you can do to get yourselves in trouble and what to watch out for. And it's written really well because it's written in regular layman terms for non-lawyers. So she does a really good job of explaining complicated legal things in normal words in a way that, at least when I was reading it, I was like, wow, I just think a normal person would understand this. It was excellent. I haven't finished it yet, but I just wanted to suggest to everybody, if you want to Google it and look for it, it is fabulous. I thought it should be mandatory for us to all read it. No, I can't. I don't know what the heck.
Did we send that out? Did we send that out? Because I think we've sent out several of those. Was that one of those ones? Yeah.
Oh, there was just an article in the CNL magazine or
Okay.
something, and it
Yeah.
made reference, or maybe she wrote an article or referenced her. I just decided to Google her, and I found this excellent article. I just thought it was very timely. It talked about sexual harassment and how to be sure that we don't get sued as a city for things that have been said or done, and how to protect ourselves, and code of conduct, and all that stuff. It was really good. It just,
We can look for it and we'll send it out. The other thing is Kevin is highly recommending that you guys at least look through the CERSA handbook that we've given all of you. That really goes through the do's and don'ts. And that's probably what her presentation was from that. So Kevin is recommending that all of you look through it for the workshop.
The second item,
Third.
attention. Would you consider joining all finances of the city that you presented to general public about the budget need for sustainable financial? Just think that another would be.
Yeah, I've met with most everybody, and I'm meeting with you guys this weekend to go over some of those, but I can definitely, I don't want to take much time because this is so important, I think, for you guys to move forward. But maybe even during lunch while you're eating, I can do a quick highlight of the budget.
I just wanted to add that there's also a video that she does for the do's and don'ts, and I think Bob and Nancy and myself saw it in the council presentation. That's also worth watching. It's in the same vein. It's only like 12 minutes or something, but it's a great do and do thing.
Do we have anything more relative to the council retreat? Denise, thanks for putting that together. Sounds like it's going to be a good opportunity for us. Next item of business is to receive council correspondence. Bob, we'll start out with you.
I was at the Housing Advisory Board meeting last night, and I didn't bring my notes, but one of the things that they are putting on their strategic plan, which they're going to be coming to council to talk about, and that's something we've also talked about, is our relationship with boards and commissions, and that's another issue, to actually license landlords, that renters, people say, we're looking at a renter's bill of rights, and they're looking, and I know that apparently the planning department is very supportive of this, so this is something that they are now researching. And there's a number of other things that they're going to be adding to their plan for the year that they will publish. And secondly, they just, they're working with a nonprofit to go out, they got $15,000 from El Paso County, and I believe $10,000 from the city, and in the budget that we approved for HAB, and they're going to be going out and sending postcards to everyone in the city to ask them if they need environmental corrections to their houses. So window sealing, LED light bulbs, whatever, and and it'll be completely administered by this nonprofit. So some really exciting things that the Housing Advisory Board is looking at that we need to be aware of, more aware of in the future. So that's all. And I'm their new liaison, so it was kind of interesting to meet them all and just learn a little bit more about what they're doing. That's all.
Nothing?
This is where we're supposed to tell you if we got any correspondence or not? Oh, nobody wrote to me.
My only correspondence is about the contract with GFL, and I think you guys will probably touch on that in your update.
GFL.
All right, well, that concludes council correspondence. City administrator report.
I'll let Bryce start.
All right, so continue to work on parking, and we have a Hiawatha meeting coming up in a couple days, so I'll continue to work on possible revenues we can get from a parking garage and some recommendations on how we go further with that. There, as you know, water leaks continue in town. We had a pretty big one, and I don't know if you saw the photos of the hole that would be. But the water department's doing a great job getting out there and fixing these pipes, so I'm real proud of their efforts. It seems like once a week now there's something breaking, so it's, they're doing a great job hanging in there. We did drive Manitou Avenue. I know there's some potholes. I think they're trying to get the potholes temporarily filled, and then later Friday they're going to get some hot patch to be able to fill them in. A lot of that works from CDOT. It has to be done, but we do some of the patching when we need to. Just so you know, for the new council members, we are getting an app, C-Click Fix, so that the residents can take pictures of problems. If they see a pothole, it goes right to Public Works. Supervisors get it, they assign it, it goes out, and once it's fixed, you get an email back saying it's fixed. So that we're hoping in a few weeks here to have that out, and we'll present it to you as well so you know how to use it. That's it.
So I have several. One is we've done a little bit of organizational change. We're putting some more focus and energy on public works to really get some projects done and to support the public works. So we're doing a little bit of that. I continue to meet with business owners and with other individuals just for introductions and get a perspective of what their needs may be. We've collected 9 surveys to date out in the little survey boxes. I have not looked at them yet, so I don't know what that means, but we have a couple people that's filling those out, which is fabulous. The business plan, you guys have the business plan. It is going to go live tomorrow on our website. So it's the first business plan that I think has been put together for a city and for everybody to see what each department is working on and their focus. So that will be going. RFP for the PIO went out yesterday, and we already have some applicants that have submitted for that, so that is fabulous. Public information officer in community engagement, so we're gonna do that by a contractual basis for this upcoming year, and that was in the budget. So we're doing that. Strategic planning meeting last Friday, we had about a 4.5 hour meeting with all the directors. Really did a abbreviated SWOT analysis. Really took some time to talk about where our focus is for this upcoming year, and the number one thing is really communication with each other, with you, and with our residents. So the PIO is really going to help with that as we move forward. So when there's a water main break or something is happening, we're communicating that, we're letting people know, we're giving them updates on the plans and the projects and where we are and what's happening with those. And then Best Way, or GFL, we continue to work with that and manage that contract. I think we're hopefully we're getting a better place. I don't have all the details worked out yet, but we are managing it, and it will come back to council in the July timeframe.
Thank you very much. That's a lot of good news. I know there's a lot of hard work behind that, so I want to thank you, Denise, and Roy. Thank you very much, and if you extend our appreciation down the line. I see the city employees working hard and doing good things. I hear good things coming back from the citizens, so that's much appreciated. Good. Yeah.
Just a question on GFL. There's the uncertainty about the price increase. Is there any clarity that's going to go out to the public on that at this point?
Yeah, I believe that it will be in the paper this week. That was our hope, but they are going back to the previous price, and they will be crediting anybody that was charged accordingly. So we did negotiate that at this point. They'll go back to the 2018 prices and provide the credit.
So that can be publicly announced even if we don't get charged.
It should be in the paper on Wednesday. Okay. Yep.
Thank you.
And I think that's a great point. If you go on Facebook, our Facebook, the whole gamut.
Yep, and I've asked GFL for an entire communication plan of how they're going to get that out. And I know that they're working on that right now.
Perfect, thank you.
Is that because they overcharged the city or something? I really don't know what you're talking about.
There were some charges, when they got purchased, they did some charges, and we probably didn't do enough analysis, they didn't do enough, and so we've agreed that right now we're just going to go back to the 2018 and then go back to council in the July timeframe with a new contract.
And wasn't the rate increase specifically regarding recyclables?
No, it was in every aspect of it. And so recycles, that is something that they really don't have a choice on, because that's a new law or mandate or fee that's required for everybody. But we've got to be careful because we don't want to discourage recycling in our community. I have done some comparisons with others, so we are.
I guess just a little aesthetic question. I guess I'm sort of kind of not really terribly pleased that they're running around town with their bright fluorescent green spray paint. Do we have any input into that? It seems like to me that garbage containers ought to be sort of, I hate to say it, just aesthetically sort of kind of a dark color that kind of blends in. And it doesn't seem like to me we ought to be facilitating such kind of a garish, advertising scheme, given that this is a city contract. Just a thought as I see more and more of these kind of ugly things kind of popping up around town.
I've had citizens tell me the same thing, that would prefer that they be a more neutral color that blends. So this is not a new, it may come as a new here tonight. I've had a number of citizens complain about this very thing. And I don't know if that's something we can put in the contract or not, but it's definitely being talked about. And then just to answer your question, I think that most residents assume that we had a contract and the rates wouldn't change during that contract. So they see the change in rates that GFL did once they acquired Bestway as not being acceptable because we have a contract with them. So if the contract says my rate's going to be this, I shouldn't get something else in the mail if the city hasn't signed a new contract agreement. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah,
I think that's what I'm hearing.
Bestway did do a rate increase every year. So they did do a rate increase, and that is part of the contract. We just negotiated a few things based on some misunderstandings.
It's working through transition.
Right.
It's been a little painful transition, but Denise is all over it.
And actually, the person from Bestway,
It's been wonderful.
Jules, is that his name?
Judd.
Yes, sorry. But he's been great too, by the way. I mean, anybody that we've referred to him, he's been right on top of trying to get with them. So that's been really helpful, and I don't want them to not get that credit here tonight, because he really has done.
Okay, just so I understand that, so the city authorized a long-term contract with Bestway, which has since been bought out by this other company. When did that contract expire, or did it not expire yet?
It does not, it has not expired, no.
When does it
I
expire?
can't remember the exact date, the expiration, I'm sorry, I can't remember that exact date off the top of my head.
So, the new company just is stuck with our contract, right? I mean, so I don't understand what's,
For this agenda item, we're going into a lot of detail. If it's something that needs to come back at for more discussion, we really do need to agendize it, because right now it isn't agendized, it just falls under the report. So I'm just concerned about
Thank you.
waiting longer.
Thank you.
All right, in that case, looks like we've covered everything. Anything else? If not, we're adjourned.
Good job.
Thank you much.